Welcome to the Exhorter podcast. This is a quick little note before the beginning of this episode. This isn't a traditional Thanksgiving episode. This is one we've been working on for a few weeks, and so it was time to push this one out, and we didn't have one specifically for the holidays coming up here, but in the spirit of Thanksgiving, we wanted to thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting us, and we will continue to make these podcasts as long as you're listening. So we thank you for your support, and we hope you have a safe holiday, and you can enjoy God's great blessings on us all. Thank you.
Welcome to the Exhorter podcast, where we aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. I'm joined here today with John Bradford, Kyle Goodwin, and special guest Steve Johnson is joining us here today. Thank you for being with us. John, I think you have our topic today, and it's one that really needs to be talked about. What are we going to talk about in this episode?
Yeah, this is a very important topic. We are going to be talking about Christians and mental health. I will give a disclaimer up front. This episode isn't specifically addressing sensitive topics such as anxiety, depression, or suicide, but those topics may come up in the conversation. Also, I am not a mental health professional, but I have been working in the education space, developing lessons to teach high schoolers to adults about some areas of mental health. And in that research and learning, I've come to have a strong advocacy for the subject. And that's why I'd love to have the conversation here with you guys today. The concepts of mental health and mental illness have touched all of our lives, whether we've identified it as such or not. This is one of those topics we don't talk about in the church much, so there can be a lot of misinformation circulated. And we've also had some recent conversations in the high school Bible class around the subject, so I felt it was an important time to discuss it. Okay, so bear with me just a few minutes. Before we have the conversation about mental health as it relates to us Christians, I'm going to get all technical and clinical for just a quick minute, just so that we can establish some common knowledge around the differences between mental health and mental illness. Mental health usually refers to your ability to handle or cope with stress and enjoy daily life. It includes the way you feel, think, act, and the way you relate to others. A mental illness or disorder is a diagnosable disorder that can be caused by factors like genes, brain chemistry, or trauma. Although these terms are often used interchangeably, poor mental health and mental illness are not the same. A person can experience poor mental health and not be diagnosed with a mental illness. Likewise, a person diagnosed with a mental illness can experience periods of physical and mental social well-being. So before we open up the discussion, here are a few mental health and mental illness statistics, just to show how prevalent these issues are in our world today. All right, so first, it's estimated that over 43.7 million adults in the USA have mental illness. 2 out of 5 adults report symptoms of anxiety or depression. Suicide is now the 10th leading cause of death in our country. ER visits for attempted suicide are up 51% among adolescent girls. In the decade before COVID-19, there was a 57% increase in suicide rate among young people. And I'm sure that's changed because of COVID. I'm sure it's accelerated. And lastly, 42% of high school students say they feel persistent feelings of hopelessness and sadness. And the reason why that's important is those are 2 of the leading factors to thoughts of suicide. So let's just open up with some thoughts about those statistics.
Well, John, I appreciate you bringing up this topic. I can't speak to any of the technical terms you mentioned, but even in my job at the county, I become much more aware of what mental health is in this community and where we live, and just how it affects people in ways that even beyond what I knew. It's actually becoming a bit of a crisis when it comes to healthcare in this area. But this podcast is geared towards Christians who may have a different perspective, and they may still be struggling with it. So I think the thing that we're talking about here is you can be a Christian and have strong faith in God and appear to have everything going well, but yet still struggle with mental health. And I know we'll talk, John, about probably one of the first things we need to talk about is acknowledgement that there are mental health illnesses or issues, and you're not alone. And so if you're a believer listening to this, you're not alone. We're going to talk about that issue and what you can do about it, but you are not alone in that. And it's staggering to hear the stats. I hear them all the time at work, and it's It's horrifying, really, to hear some of the issues that are out there today. But you're not alone if you're listening to this. This is something that many Christians, many people in our own congregation are struggling with in one way, shape, or form. And I think we'll talk about, we'll see examples in the Bible of those who may have struggled as well.
I find a strong parallel with the concept of sin and how God calls us to expose our sin, to be clothed with humility towards one another, to confess our sins to one another. These are topics we've discussed already in this podcast and have more ideas to discuss in further episodes. And I wonder often how many people on a Sunday, when I look out from the pulpit, look out over the crowd, how many people are struggling with a sin that they're just too ashamed to get help with? And I think there's probably a very similar parallel to mental illness, to mental health, to things like depression, that it becomes something like the sin that I need help and I'm struggling with it, but I'm worried about the stigma. I'm worried about the way people will view me or the perception of it. So I will just keep it to myself and suffer in silence, when we should be confessing. We should be clothed in humility towards one another. We should be unafraid of the type of reaction we'll get by saying, I'm struggling. It's almost like we're shocked that other people sin, or we're shocked that other people have struggles in their life, and some of it relate to mental health.
Yeah, Kyle, I think you're right. Break the stigma is a common phrase around mental health, and stigmas of just being seen as broken or weak or crazy, and many don't reach out to get the help they need. Even with all those stats and just sheer life experience, there are still some who question the validity of mental illness, such as the clinical depression, for example. Have you heard of any in the church who have doubted mental illnesses, or what's a common phrase used that we've heard of generally?
Well, just pray more. That's the common response, is it not? You're depressed. Well, you just need to pray more.
Lack of faith, doubt in God. Yeah. And why do you think that exists?
A fear of mine is that this can go both ways. I think that there is probably a good amount of depression. Well, we use the word so flippantly now. I'm so depressed about this, or my football team lost. I'm so depressed. We use that word so flippantly that I think we need to be cautious about that. There are serious, real medical examples of depression that might need medical intervention and medical treatment. I think there is a good number of, and you can't see me, but I'm using air quotes with my hands. There is a good amount of depression that probably isn't depression, like in the sense that we're talking in a clinical sense, that probably could be, again, air quotes, cured with just a little bit of better sleep, a little bit of exercise, and a little bit of prayer. And there probably is some truth to that idea, but I think that kind of brushes under the rug real depression. So we need to be, on the one hand, cautious about being dismissive of depression, but also cautious about flippantly using the concept of depression when it's not actual depression or clinical depression.
And I think that's why, it's important to be more informed.
Just wanted to make a point back to this issue of the organic component, because I think we need to, recognize that this is an illness. We would not say to somebody, for example, if you have an illness, don't treat it. But there's a doctor who I've happened to follow, Dr. Daniel Amen. And he's done a number of books on mental health, mental illness. His point is that it's really about brain health and less about the medications that are used to address it. So Amen does what he calls brain specs, which means that he will take pictures of people's brains under stress when they're worried and then at rest, and he will compare them. It's just medical information. I like that in the sense that if we say it's brain health and we admit that that's certainly part of this, I do think that, again, back to faith and back to, what we believe in, we could almost say that Christianity is brain health. Because at the end of the day, what we're relying on, our faith, what we're counting on, is something that is bigger than us. It's not a pill. It's not something that you take to get rid of something. But I think we do recognize that there's an organic component, but it needs to be very clearly defined.
Okay, let's talk about medication. There are a lot of views about medication for mental health and illness, and there has been a popular belief out there that Christians shouldn't take medication for mental health like depression or anxiety because these behaviors should be addressed through prayer and faith. I think these views have been held for two reasons. One, we have a history of ignorance and not understanding the differences between feeling anxious and having clinical anxiety, condition that sometimes needs medical intervention. And two, because it's true, our prayer and faith in God can and does help us. So there are some pros and cons to the medication conversation. I've seen it help people tremendously, and I've seen some cases it might not be needed or even helpful.
What works for one person might not work the same for another. And again, as I suggested earlier, I imagine there's probably a good number of people that think they're depressed and really just have bad diet, sleep, and exercise habits. But there are some people that are on the other end of the spectrum, and they really need some sort of medical intervention. They need some sort of assist from medications, if you will. So there's a big spectrum here in severity, but there's also a big spectrum in how people respond.
There's a study I looked up, Journal of Scientific Study of Religion, 1,600 Americans, those who had a weak relationship to God were more likely to be anxious and suffer mental illness. Now, to me, that's significant. That's the kind of thing that we need to look at that's quantified. Our faith, and not by faith alone. Again, there's certainly an organic component, but our faith can assist significantly with mental health and mental illness. What's staggering to me is the number of antidepressants that are prescribed every year as the first option to deal with mental health problems. I think we can agree that there's probably some organic component to mental health and mental illness. But the concern that I have over the last 6 years, antidepressants, the prescriptions have increased 34.8%. Most concerning is among young adults. It's increased almost 8%. So as a first option, the medical community is saying we need to prescribe medication to deal with that.
Steve, I know what you're saying, and I think you're right. A lot of the time, the problem with this conversation, though, is due to the all or nothing thoughts. Can your faith in God and prayer help with your mental health? Absolutely. Can it help with mental illness? Again, absolutely. But sometimes the biological component of mental illness also needs medical interventions. It's just like having any other health problem. Will we pray first and foremost for our health? Yes. Will we go to the doctor for a broken leg or heart problems? Yes. I've seen medication help people, but it's still concerning how fast it is the first option for our kids.
Well, there shouldn't be a stigma against it among Christians. I'd love to share something. It's someone that's been a Facebook acquaintance of mine for a while. He actually visited here a little over a year ago. He's a preacher by the name of Matt Bassford, and he wrote this back in January. Last summer, as the reality of my terminal diagnosis was dawning on me, that's ALS, by the way, if you're not familiar with him, I experienced a mental health crisis. In response to this crisis, I began taking 2 antidepressants, trazodone and Lexapro. Now that 6 months have passed, I thought it'd be worthwhile to revisit that decision and its consequences. I've never had a problem with other Christians using mental health meds, but it wasn't something I'd wanted for myself either. I've been prone to depression throughout my adult life. Looking back, I count at least 7 major depressive episodes. However, last July was the first time I sought professional help. Before that, I hadn't wanted to acknowledge my struggles to anyone, and I'm strong-willed enough that I figured I could muscle through it on my own. Does that sound familiar to a lot of us? This is me talking now, not Matt. But doesn't that sound like, I feel like I've probably been there at times too, and I think that's a very relatable. So reading on just a little bit further, once I started my medications, though, my improvement was swift and dramatic. I don't think this is typical. I'm probably something of a poster child for chemical intervention. Nonetheless, the trazodone quickly suppressed the nocturnal anxiety attacks that were depriving me of sleep. Because I was better rested, I was able to get a handle on the depression with the Lexapro's help. That help proved to be more modest than people often think it is. I've heard brethren say that they don't want to take antidepressants because they don't want to be numb inside. That's not how I felt. Instead, the meds felt to me like touching something while wearing thin knit gloves. I still had the same sensations, but the edges weren't as sharp. On the flip side, the antidepressants didn't do the work for me either. They gave me a ladder, but they didn't haul me out of the pit. I had to redirect my own thoughts down healthier paths. Interestingly, one of my most powerful tools in this was prayer, but not prayer for myself. When I caught myself dwelling on my dreadful future, I started praying my way through the roster of members at Jackson Heights in considerable length and detail. I found that my prayers benefited me as much as the recipients. Conversely, if I had sat back and waited for the pills to do their thing, I don't think I would have improved much, if at all. Antidepressants aren't magic potions, and when people take them expecting an easy fix, they're going to be disappointed. And he writes more, but I think that segment alone helps. And I thought it was really powerful to come from a very well-respected preacher, someone I enjoy reading his articles. I enjoy listening to his sermons. I certainly respect him. And I thought it was very powerful for him to very publicly share his experiences with it and try and bust that stigma up a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great example, Kyle. A great way to think about medication for those who have a diagnosed mental disorder sometimes is the brain needs the cloud of the mental illness to be lifted enough for them to seek and apply God's word more effectively.
I like that he was trying to encourage people. Don't look at this as a magic potion that's going to instantly fix everything. You still have to do the work, but it gives you the tools and it equips you to be able to pull yourself out of the pit, so to speak, to use his metaphor.
Sometimes I think there is a distrust of what decisions are made either in the medical field or within psychology as to how they may treat mental illness. So, I say that's above my pay grade. If it's effective, I don't see a problem with it if it works. I think the key is, as a Christian, you've got to keep working towards a solution. I think what Kyle just read was, there's no silver bullet that you can take a pill and mental health is taken care of. I don't, from a medical field, I don't have the degree to make that determination. What I do know is the Bible does speak to people who are battling depression or who are battling what may be mental illness, and they say things that speak to, literally to the point that they're ready to end it all. You read some of the Psalms. And the second part is, I think it's, I can't speak to that, but I can speak to what the Bible says about having it, what the Bible speaks about as Christians, that you're not alone. And we as Christians in a church need to be more open about our struggles and realize that a lot of those who struggle alone, and they stay within their homes, or they never share what's really going on. They come to church and they put on a happy face and everything looks great. But from a biblical standpoint, I think what we really need to talk about is, how can you be able to more openly share this and talk about it? I can't speak to medication as far as, yes or no. From a biblical perspective, there may be some evidence of that, and I can't speak against it either. But I do know that we don't talk about it enough, and there's plenty of examples in the Bible of people who struggle with these things. But I also know it's not as simple as some, Kyle, you were saying, well, just, pray it away, or it's not that simple. And I read Psalms of David, where he is, I'll read just a quick example, Psalm 38. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate. All the day I go about mourning, for my sides are filled with burning. There's no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. I could go on, but this is David, a man after God's own heart, speaking this way. And so to me, that's one of the main messages I would want to send to listeners is, one, you're not alone. Two, there's a myth that depression or mental health is somehow a sign of weak faith. And I don't think that's necessarily the case unless I'm walking in your shoes, that those two things always connect. I think there's times that it does. But even David, at times. Now, did he need, once he saw the Lord and got his perspective back, sometimes at the end of these Psalms, he's in a different place. And you can see that, God answered his prayers. But every time he's down on his knees, or maybe he's down on his face, praying to God, sometimes crying. And later you see an answer to that prayer. So is there a link between you can be in the utter despair and depression, and it could be mental health, but also your reliance on God to help get you a different perspective? So that's my thoughts.
Just by talking about it more, as Paul suggested in his comments, I hope that even just addressing it in this podcast will help to, even just in this small corner of the world here in California, kind of get rid of that stigma, even just a little bit. Because when I'm hearing Paul talk just a second ago, what I'm thinking of is how in Galatians 6 we're called to bear one another's burdens. But how can I bear your burden if you're putting on a show every Sunday? You're hiding your burdens behind a smile that betrays the turmoil within you. And so the reason why we bury away, whether it's sin or whether it's trauma we're experiencing or whether it's distress, is because we don't want to be judged. We don't want to feel judged. We don't want the ridicule. And so we need to talk about it. And when I think of this topic, it's Proverbs 18 and verse 14 that has always come to my mind. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 14, it says, "The spirit of a man will sustain him in his sickness." So when my body is weak, I can be strong mentally. I can have that resolve. I'm going to get over this, or I'm going to keep high spirits. But who can bear a broken spirit? And I've thought about this verse for years and the implications of it. You can endure a lot of physical hardship. You can endure a lot of injury and illness to your body by keeping your spirits up. But when your spirit is broken, that's hard to bear. And so for whatever reasons we might be talking about depression or anxiety or any number of mental struggles, mental health struggles, I think that verse right there in Proverbs says it's a heavy load to bear, especially on your own. And how about a New Testament example too? The Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 1 says that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. He was burdened beyond strength, his own ability to care for, his own ability to take care of himself. And he said, we despaired even of life. So I think even Paul is showing a little vulnerability here.
So when I look at the Bible, I think a common verse, 1 Peter 5:7, we're to cast our anxieties on him because he cares for us. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that we stop trying, I think, to the comments made earlier, but I think it means that we also trust in God's wisdom, and our first desire is to go to him. So I think that's very important. The other example that we're well aware of is in Luke 10:41, where Jesus talks to Martha. And this is about, John, your point earlier about anxiety and worry, which are parts of mental health. And he says, listen, you worry too much. Stop worrying. Jesus was a very, very serious, when he was on this, or a very serious person. I don't recall him being stressed out, right? He seemed to be in the moment, even when he was very busy. He made time for people. As he went through his life here on earth, he was able to do that, I think, it felt like a seamless way. So the message is he would go to his Father, God, when he had concerns. He would pray constantly, regularly about issues of concern. So I think that's a model I think we can also follow.
Yeah.
If Jesus could do that, and again, he's a model for us as Christians, then we need to really focus on how we can do that in a way that's meaningful. We go to God. And I think the last thing I'll mention is that when I was very, very young, I went to a leadership camp. There was a preacher named Buf Carricker who was there, well known in the Valley. Buf was an interesting guy, kind of larger than life. He used to say, coming to church is like going to a hospital. And I always thought, well, that didn't make sense to me when I was younger. It's not like going to a hospital, but it is. Now that I'm older, it makes perfect sense. We come here broken. We all have issues of concern. We all have stories to tell, right, with our brokenness. And I think church is an important part of us dealing with that. One of the things I would say is what we share as Christians maybe is our brokenness. So mental health is certainly part of that.
Well, Steve, you bring up a really excellent point there in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. I think we need to work on removing this stigma about seeking medical advice, medical intervention, medical care for mental health. But I also think we still ought to be encouraging people, try some of the simple, if you haven't tried some of these simple changes first, we want to remove the stigma about seeking medical advice, but try some of the simple things first. And if you haven't done that, try adding an hour of sleep every night. Try adding an extra 20 minutes of prayer scheduled in your day. Try 20 minutes of walking or a little bit of exercise. Try some of those simple things, and prayer, especially with this idea of 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's start there. And if the struggle is more serious and it's not alleviated with some of these more simple fixes, let's seek out a little more professional help, a little more. Let's seek out a little more of that medical help. Let's start with some simple things, because Jesus does say, "Cast your anxiety upon me."
And I think that's perfect for those who they know they're dealing with some sort of mental health issue or crisis, but they might not really know or think yet that they have a mental illness, right? Something a little harder to manage by themselves. And I think James 5 is another good example of that. If you are sick, call upon the elders in the church, to pray over you, pray with you. As you talked about earlier, reaching out to people, getting help. And I'd say, if you're sick, we know prayer works.
Well, I've been praying for you for years to get over your infatuation with the New England Patriots, and it hasn't worked yet.
There it is. Yeah. No, I knew it was coming. So,
I just want to come full circle because John, you were asking a while back about, what you call medical or psychological intervention. And we've gone back to, what does the Bible say? And I think we should. But if I'm going to go see a counselor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, whatever it may be, the only thing I would say that from another perspective that we need to be careful about is the world of psychology today does scare me. And what I mean by that is when you go see someone, we've talked a lot in our congregation recently about what is your worldview? What is your view of the world? And if the person you're seeing, their view of the world does not include God, does not include the biblical worldview, it could be more damaging depending on who you go see. And so, one word of caution, if you're going to see someone and seeking professional help, if their worldview is not Christian, I would be wary. And a lot of times you can find that out by talking to them, or a lot of times those who are believers and have a Christian worldview will advertise that and say that. And so they will approach things from that perspective. But that is a word of caution. If you're going in and what they're suggesting to you does not match what we read in the Bible, I've also seen some damage done that actually made their condition worse. So just a word of caution.
Yeah, I have some family members who have gone to quote Christian psychiatrists, and they're out there. They advertise that. It's been a positive impact on them. So they're out there, and I think that that's definitely the way that if I were to go, which I've thought about in the past, and maybe I will in the future. If I would go to one, it would be one with the same worldview, as you say, and like faith.
Well, that's a very valid concern, because I would imagine that oftentimes their end goal is your happiness, your contentment, and how we define contentment from a biblical worldview might be very different. The concepts of service and sacrifice, I'm willing to, like Paul in the Corinthian letters, I suffer all of this. I give up everything. I lose everything. I die every day so that others live. And that's the formula for a really content life as God defines it. That might not be how man or therapists might define contentment.
Well, another example, and this is today. One of our young people, with what you're seeing in the culture today, is struggling with their, quote, gender identity. The approach that is taken today in the mental health world is what they call affirmation. That means that they could go see someone, and rather than helping them, they affirm something that they may believe, even at, say, 10 or 12 years old, that yes, you should go with that, even if it's something that clearly is not what God created them to be. And maybe even encourage them to make decisions that are contrary to their own best interest. And the way the laws are written, parents may not even know, what's being encouraged to their children. So just, again, same idea. If you're seeing someone, just make sure that you know their worldview before you go. We've talked a lot about those who may be dealing with this, but I also just want to be real that I'm thinking all of us at different times. I don't know what you want to slap a label on it, whether it's depression or mental health or whatever it might be. But for me, in my life, there's been periods of what I would call hopelessness. At least that's how I felt in the moment. And I was a believer, and you never would have known it, perhaps, at the time. But it was, some of the darker times in my life, when I look back at that. And usually at those times, I lost sight of the big picture. I lost sight of, some of the things that I needed to keep focused on. But I will also say, as a Christian and as a believer, that's what really got me through it in the end. But there, I want to be real with those listening. Each of us here have experienced times of hopelessness, times of depression. I don't know what the label is for that. But you're not alone. And if you're a believer listening to this, just to say we love you. And if you need help, you need to reach out to those around you who are Christians and believers. If you're a member of this congregation, talk to someone, whether it's one of us or another Christian or leader in the congregation that you feel close to. Don't be afraid to do that. We have all struggled. And if there's any message I'd like to send, is just, you're not alone.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I will echo those sentiments. We all struggle in this life. We all need help and to support each other. I'm very happy I have these men here to talk to, open up to, and share life struggles with. And I hope that you can find people to do that with in your own life. If not, therapy or any other type of intervention. I know we are all open here to have conversations with any of you if you need help. This may not have been the most definitive look and conversation on mental health and illnesses, but I hope our conversation today has been a good start of the conversation, opening up this deep, complex topic.
Well, and that's kind of the MO of this podcast anyway. If we're not going to give definitive black and white answers, we're going to model Christian conversation. And I think the conversation itself can be a good exercise if just bringing awareness to this, or normalizing that it's okay to talk about these things when we've been so hush-hush about it for so many years.
Well, John, thanks for bringing up this important topic. This was a good thing for us to explore and talk about, and we're going to have some episodes that may dive even deeper into this, so stay tuned for those. We want to thank you for joining, and also, if you've listened to this on our Facebook page, please share it. We want others to know or like it. That helps others to learn about this podcast. And as we like to say here, we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for watching.
Paul, thanks for the lead out there. Just one quick word at the end here. I just want to make sure that if any of you are experiencing any hopelessness, feelings of self-harm or suicide, you can reach out to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline just by calling or texting 988 if you need that help. Otherwise, we are not medical professionals, but we are always willing and able to listen and help you with any need that you might have. So please reach out to a medical professional if you feel like you need additional help. Thank you.
Do we want to finish on a lighter note? In Mark chapter 5, we read about the guy with a legion of demons. He's running around the tombs naked. And it says in verse 15 that they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion sitting and clothed and in his right mind. So one symptom of not being in your right mind is not being fully clothed.
Good advice, Kyle. Good advice.
Yeah.
Keep your clothes on.
If you're gonna go around naked and exposing yourself, then you are not in your right mind.
Right mind.
You are insane.